Greetings and welcome to Maisha Kazini. In this video, I'm going to add my voice to the conversation about what is happening in CBC. Of late, there have been reports in the media about the inequality in the junior secondary schools. And everybody thinks that this is about the money, and the problem is that CBC has not been properly funded. But actually, the problem is deeper than just simple funding. And that's what I want to explain before I also suggest a way forward. And the way forward might surprise some of you, but I think it's good to have our options, that we have different things we are thinking about. All right, so let's start. I'm going to use visuals because I think there are some technical details which are escaping us. And I think that they are necessary for us to see where the problem is starting from. So let's begin. So what you can see here is 844, the system that is being phased out. And as we all know, it was 8 years in primary, 4 years in secondary, and 4 years in university. Before now I talk about CBC, let me address one of the criticisms of 844, which I think was very flawed and led to us not understanding what was wrong with CBC. And this criticism was that 844 taught all the subjects to all the students, and a student who might have been weak in sciences was denied a place in university to do the arts because their average was brought down by the sciences. And this argument was used to say that that is why students should not do subjects in which they have no talent. And I'll come back to that idea of talent later. What is wrong with this argument? The problem is that university admission is not simply about results. It's about places available for students to join. And in fact, exams are used not as a measure to gauge people's intelligence as we think, but it's used as a way of selecting those who will go to university and those who will not. So the selection process is not about whether people have talent or not, but about having very few spaces in which students can enter university. Now, for example, if you have 800,000 students sitting for KCSE and universities can only absorb 200,000, how do you weed out the students who will not go to university, which is 3/4 of the students? You use exams. So it is not true to say that somebody was not accepted in university because they had a low grade, because they are not talented in biology and they were forced to do biology, yet they wanted to do literature. It is simply not true. What is true is that many more students who did literature also passed in sciences, and so they had a higher average than the student who got an A in literature and a D in maths. I think it's important that we be clear about this, that selection, please, selection to the next stage of schooling is a question of resources, not intelligence or exam performance. This argument that I have made has to be understood for you to understand the rest of the things that I am saying. If you believe that somebody didn't go to university to do history because they were not talented in biology, then we are not in the same conversation, and the rest of what I'm going to say is probably not going to make sense to you. So let's go to what was proposed in CBC. According to the plan, CBC was supposed to have 6 years of primary school, so that is 2 years less in primary school, and then 6 years of secondary school, but it was divided into two, the junior secondary and the senior secondary. And then university was going to have less years, which is one less year, so that will be 3 years. Now, we all know that come 2022, towards the end of the year, parents were realizing that their grade 6 children who are barely 12 years old were now supposed to go and look for a high school. And first of all, the children were too young to be going to high school with hardened Form 4s who are sitting KCSE and have been in the system for a while. That was one problem. And so that was one reason why people suggested that the children remain in primary school. The other problem was that the junior secondary school was supposed to have been built by the time the children were reaching grade 6, so that now they go to grade 7 in JSS. And secondly, the teachers were supposed to have been trained. Now, we all know that Kenya was in debt, was borrowing like a fool, elections were coming, so nobody was really planning for how junior secondary schools would be enough for all the children who were in primary schools. Of course, Professor Magoha, the late, went around the country promising that the junior secondary schools were available, but as with Kenyan politics, that regime came to an end, and of course the schools were not enough. So that was why after the Kenya Kwanza government came into power, the suggestion was that the children remain in primary school, and then the JSS teachers come to the primary school to teach the grade 7 to 9 there. So what was supposed to happen before that decision was made was that grade 7 to 9 would go to JSS, and then grade 10 to 12 would go to the senior secondary schools, which are already the schools we have. So I've already mentioned two problems with this plan. One was the young age of the children, but the second one was the resources. But there was a further problem with this proposal. What happened after 2022 was that basically primary school became JSS, and now the places under 844 that are secondary schools have now been designated as senior secondary schools. The problem looks very simple, but there's a further complication that is making the problem even more messy. And that is the problem of the pathways. What was supposed to happen is that the pathways were supposed to be introduced in junior secondary school. Basically, the way we did 844, where all the subjects were taught in secondary school, now this was being brought lower to junior secondary school. So STEM was supposed to be introduced in JSS. Talent or arts, which to me is a problem, was supposed to be introduced in JSS. Humanities as another pathway was supposed to be introduced in JSS, and then TVET was supposed to be introduced here. So now instead of you waiting to go to university to do a BSc in science, the thinking was, why don't you start the STEM subjects early, and then if you go to university or not, you're in the STEM pathway, and so on. So the idea was that everybody does the STEM, talent, humanities, TVET in junior secondary school, so that when they go to senior secondary school, they pick one pathway and run with it, and then when they go to university, they continue to specialize. But what was the problem with this idea? For me, at an intellectual level, I found it a problem because I was saying, what's the point of specializing so early? Why are you denying children the breadth of subjects until high school? And then when they go to university, they can specialize there. But the reason why the education officials were pursuing this idea was because that's what the A-level system was. People dropped their sciences and arts sometimes as early as Form 2 or Form 4. And so when they went to university, if you were a science student, you didn't see any literature after Form 4. And you did 2 years of high school and you went to the university and never did any bridging subject in the humanities. And that is what produces the problem of scientists who can't think in terms of society. But anyway, somehow Kenyans believed the lie that early specialization makes people better. No, it doesn't. It makes them more narrow. I tried to make this argument, but people couldn't hear what I was saying because of the other argument that I've just talked about, the idea that people are being denied university of education not because of resources, but because of the subjects they took. So you can see, once you believe something wrong, everything else you believe will become wrong. Anyway, what was supposed to happen is that in JSS, you get exposed to all the pathways, and then in senior secondary, you choose your school based on the pathway you took. And that is part of where some of the panic is, because some people have been suggesting that the best schools become STEM schools, which of course you can see is privileging science over the arts. That the best, especially best equipped schools, become the STEM schools, and then all the others be relegated to whatever, talent, whatever, and then some probably don't even go to senior secondary. Now, that sounds okay, except what is the criteria on which we are going to choose? Who goes to the STEM secondary schools, who goes to the arts secondary schools, and so on. How do we choose now that we don't have examinations? That's where we are stuck, and that's what parents are panicking about. And by the way, if you check the media interviews I had in 2018, 2019, I asked this question. I asked, since now you don't supposedly have the Starehes and the Alliances as the best schools, how are you going to choose who goes to what school? And that question was not answered. Anyway, let's go on. So that was the plan, that JSS would have all these labs, all these sports facilities, all these talent, so that the children would be exposed to all these subjects. And by the time they reach end of grade 9, they will be able to choose the secondary school they want to go to based on their subjects. Have you heard? That's important. Based on the pathway they chose, not on their results, on the pathway they chose. And how was the pathway supposed to be decided? One was this very amorphous thing called parental involvement. It was supposed to be the kids sitting down with the parents and deciding, as we want this pathway. Now, we all know how Kenya is, the way we hate the arts, that most parents are going to try and push their kids into STEM so that those kids can go to the good schools. That's how Kenya is. So that's why it's a political problem, because people are wondering, how are we going to decide who will go to the good schools, quote unquote, meaning the best equipped with the good teachers and all that. So that was one factor, that it was parents who are going to decide. Now, just tell me how a kid from Kibra, whose mom sells mbogas at the market, is supposed to help their child choose the pathway that will lead him to be a doctor. They don't even have the kind of social circles that would tell them this is what is required for doctors, this is required for pilot. So basically what we were choosing was to say all children will follow their parents' station in life. So if your father is a carpenter, you become a carpenter. If your father is a doctor, you become a doctor, because that's naturally what happens when you talk of parental involvement, which I opposed. It was the one thing I opposed, in addition to pathways. So the second problem was a problem of resources. Which schools are these that have the labs and the arts facilities and all that to give their JSS kids a broad education so that the kids can make an informed decision about which senior secondary school to go to? So what you're seeing in the media when they're going, although I'm just so angry with the media, when the media are going to schools and saying, oh, this school doesn't have a lab, the chemicals are in a store and all that, they are just making it about facilities when really this is inbuilt discrimination, because from the beginning, the government knew that not all secondary schools would be equipped to give children access to pathways before making the decision about senior secondary school. So that's where the problem is. It's not a question of simply facilities. It is inequality that is now being justified in the name of parents. That is the parents who are supposed to pick the subjects. And most parents, especially if they're not educated, they don't know they don't have as much information as the parents who are educated. So it's an inbuilt inequality. Also, what parents were hearing is now, let's go back to that idea of a child not being able to do history in university because they failed in biology. Once parents believed that the problem was that a child had done a subject they were not interested in, they could not see that how they understood JSS is not what the government was saying. What parents were hearing was this, that once I pick STEM in junior secondary, I will go all the way to university with it. But that's not what government officials were saying. What they were saying is that you might go to university, you might not. Yeah. We still don't know who will go, but at least we have weeded out people who might go to university. We have weeded them out first by blocking them from entering a senior secondary school. So if a child chooses STEM and only 2% of STEM people who choose STEM can get a place in a senior secondary school, then now you have blocked the child from ever aspiring in university, to go to university. You see, that was different from 844, where if in Form 1 I like biology, I have 4 years to prove myself that I can do biology, and I work hard at it and I go to university. Here it is different. You're being selected, the kids are selected before they even reach university by being selected at the senior secondary school level. So basically what is happening is that the children who do not go get a senior secondary school of their choice, that's the end for them, which was what was there before, but it was not as cutthroat as it is now. So what you were hearing, you people were hearing that, oh, my kids' talent will be decided early and they will do that all the way to university. The government, what they wanted was that if you don't get a senior secondary school, you don't have to bother us about going to university. You see, that's different from all the Form 1s who reach Form 4 are eligible to the university. Whether they pass or not is a different matter, but they are eligible. Now, you have to first get a high school before you are allowed to go to university. And you know the genius about this system, which was what I tried to explain. Let's say you choose STEM and you don't make it for BSc in university. You cannot go back and say, look, I did well in English, which is what 844s can do. I did well in English, Kiswahili, can I come and do another subject like BA history? Now you can't do that because once you committed to STEM in JSS, that was it. You couldn't go anywhere else. And people were not hearing what I was saying. This was a way of reducing the number of children who are eligible to go to university. But you people were hearing talent, that I will pursue a single talent. And by the way, that idea is so bad. This thing of saying that children should not do what they are not interested in, come on. Are you going to feed your children on cake and ice cream instead of vegetables because they like cake more? We cannot go through life only learning what is enjoyable and what is our talent. We also have to learn the rest of the world. Anyway, the media was more powerful than me, so people didn't hear what I was saying. There's a problem of selection that now it is starting to dawn on parents that if my child does not get the pathway they want, what happens to them? Which was the question I had been asking. But the second problem is now the resource problem. The problem is with this system, now you see before in 844, you needed labs only for secondary schools. Now you need labs for both senior secondary and junior secondary, so that the junior secondary school children are exposed to science and STEM subjects. Then when they go to senior secondary, they have picked whether they'll do STEM or something else. So really what what CBC was bringing was a system where we needed double the high schools, double the specialized teachers, and double the equipment. So now, instead of funding 8 secondary schools with labs, now you have to fund 8 senior secondary schools and 8 junior secondary schools. Remember, this is an economy where we have borrowed like crazy. We have no money. And yet we kept up with the fantasy that this is how we are going to solve our education problem. Anyway, let's go on. So this is really what we are staring at if we continue with this system. We are staring at all children doing 9 years of primary school with no JSS, no pathways, nothing, doing guesswork when it comes to what pathways they will take. And then we are yet to be told how they will be chosen for senior secondary school. And given that all children are meeting expectations, because there's no teacher who is going to say their kid does not meet expectations. So given that all children are meeting expectations, how are we going to decide who will go to the STEM schools, who will go to the talent schools, who will go to the humanities, and who will go to TVET? We have still not been told, and now you parents are panicking. And yet I asked these questions. When I was asking the questions, the common response was, why do you want children to learn everything instead of learning what they are good at? And like I've said, that is such a bad logic. But the people who made these arguments about schooling and talent had been making them for 5-10 years. So it was very difficult to get a word in. What do we do now? This is what I'm going to suggest, and it's going to hurt a lot of people. So sit back before you hear what I have to say. My suggestion is this. We go back to 844. And let me explain why. Now, if we go back to where we are right now we don't have a Form 1 class because nobody did KCSE last year. And the group that should have been in Form 1 is now the grade 9 in junior secondary school. And then we have grade 8s who will be grade 9 next year, and we have grade 7s who will be grade 9 in 2 years. But essentially what we have now is primary school of 9 years with no pathways to talk of except in schools for the wealthy, where schools can afford that equipment. So this is what I'm suggesting we could do next year. Since the Form 4s will have finished, there will be only two 844 classes left, which means we can admit Form 1s and Form 2s, like a double intake, next year in the high schools. Now, how would we do this? We would do this by administering an exam. I'm sorry, I know we hate exams, but exams, as I've explained, are about selection. Until the great big day when there's 100% transition, we cannot avoid exams. But also, until we get a better economy where people are not discriminated against because of the way they did in school, where there are opportunities for people whether they went to school or not. I'm sorry, the way we have to select people is through exams. Unless we could also have a lottery, which is not a bad idea, and then we take people to school based on gambling, on chance, which, by the way, I don't think is such a bad idea. So, but this is what I am suggesting, that we have an exam for the 2 cohorts, for those in grade 9 and those in grade 8, and they will go to grade 9s will go to Form 2 under 844, and Form 1s will now go to Form 1 under 844. And then the grade 7s will become standard 8s, as always in primary school. Now, this is not a painless decision. Of course, especially the secondary school teachers are going to have a lot of time, a lot of work with a batch of new students. But remember, there will be only 2 old 844 classes. So these new grade 9s and 8s who are joining from 1 and 2 would be joining the classes that would have been occupied by Form 1 and 2 under 844. And then we go back to the university of 4 years. That is my suggestion. What are the advantages of my suggestion? One is that we all understand 844. Parents understand it, teachers understand it. Usually, and let me tell you parents how education works. Please, education is not like buying the latest car. It is not something you do that is fanciful. What education is about giving people the basics, and then from the basics, they become creative. So people already know the system. They know the system and they can give the children what they already know. And parents will not be confused. They will not know they will not be asking questions about what to do because everybody understands the system. So that's one advantage. The second advantage is that, of course, no training is required because we are dealing with not only trained teachers, but teachers with decades of experience. What does that mean? Unlike some of you who think that teachers are so stupid, let me tell you how teaching works. The more experienced you are as a teacher, the more solutions you have to emerging problems because you have the benefit of experience. So the experienced teachers can make up for the gaps that have been experienced because of these botched years spent under JSS. So the teachers, if we respect them and if the government respects them, we can depend on them to make up for the gaps so that by the time the first CBC classes in Form 4, teachers have basically caught up and have recalibrated the system, and so we can move on. Okay, so we are not dealing with stupid, unless we don't respect teachers, which apparently is the case. Teachers can manage to recalibrate the system and they won't need any more training because they already know the system. And then we won't need a double layer of schools that we need to equip with laboratories and with teachers, because that's where the problem is. By having JSS and senior secondary, we added the number of schools, books, equipment, labs that we needed to train the teachers. Now we only need labs for one layer of schools, which is the secondary schools. Rather than having labs for junior secondary and senior secondary, we only need labs for the one secondary school. Now, many of you are going to panic and you're going to say, what about the inequality in preparation of children? I'm sorry, people, the inequality has become worse. So I don't know whether you think that we are going to get out of this problem with no inequality. Sorry. And I know you're thinking of your individual children, but I wish you were thinking of them when I was raising these questions, because that is when you should have thought about it. But the inequality will not be as stark as we have it right now, where you have some children going from equipped junior secondary schools to equipped senior secondary schools, and other children who have come from a primary school with nothing in the name of junior secondary. So we need to pick a side. We're not going to get a perfect system, but we need to pick a side. Then others will bother me with, but what about syllabus coverage before the exam? Now, people, the same ministry that sets the syllabus also sets the exams, also pays the people who mark them. So at every stage, especially when you have experienced teachers, you can moderate the gaps. I think also the problem here is that Kenyans do not think that education is run by human beings. It is not run by curricula. It is not run by ministers. It is run by teachers. And if we place our trust in the teachers and tell them, we know we messed up, but you guys, can you fix this for the children? They are your children as well. The teachers can help us recalibrate the system so as to minimize the damage that we have already caused. Now, of course, there are people who are going to be opposed to this. There are some people who will just be running scared. Some of these people are especially the career educators, journalists, and activists who made a living from promoting CBC. Now, maybe you people were not listening for the last 6 years, but I said there seems to be a group of people whose job is to promote CBC, and they come from the same NGOs, they come from the same places. How come? So imagine those people who made a name for themselves promoting a system that doesn't work. I mean, let's sympathize with them. They are looking at their careers. It will not be nice for them if we go back to 844. There are also textbook companies that are making money from the CBC textbook model. You know, you CBC parents, that nowadays your children cannot share textbooks with the other children because they have to write in the textbooks. So of course, the textbook companies are looking at a loss. So textbook companies are looking at fewer books being bought by the government, not even by you, by the government, because every year we have to buy new textbooks for children because they have to write in it. So, and these are the companies, by the way, when Amina Mohammed withdrew CBC and said we were not ready, it was the textbook publishers who went to see her and to tell her to reinstate CBC. So those textbook companies are not going to be happy if we go back to 844. The other group that may oppose this is the cyber cafes and other businesses that have been earning from the struggles with CBC. So those are people are going to pay journalists and whoever else is willing to talk to ensure that CBC remains. The other thing I want to talk about is that there are basically 3 trends of philosophical approaches to the CBC question. Not everybody who likes CBC is supporting it for their own interest. They actually believe in what CBC was promising. In my general view, there are 3 philosophical positions on CBC. One is the class-based idea, the idea that people should enter their talent when they are young and stay there till the kingdom come. Then there are others who believe that CBC is a problem-solving curriculum and so it should stay. And the others are people like me who are saying the philosophy behind CBC does not allow for the development of the African mind. So let me just talk about those 3 positions. The class-based position is that everybody should fit in the place where their talent places them, because some have to lead and others have to be led, and to do the work for the leaders to manage. So there are people who believe that that's how the system works, that if people fail, we shouldn't ask about whether they had the resources to learn, whether they had good teachers. For such people, they say, no, it wasn't your talent, you didn't do well, too bad. You don't belong in STEM, and STEM is the prestigious, pathway that the best should go to, the talented best. In fact, what do the doctors call themselves? The best and the brightest. And in fact, in the very first conversation we had on CBC in 2017, one of the ardent supporters of CBC, when I said that this curriculum is going to entrench inequality, he said, what am I making noise about? That there have to be slaves in every community. And this was just after the elections. I said, are you serious? With all the political problems we face, who are the people to be designated the slaves? If we believe that everybody deserves an equal chance, this idea that people should go where their talent places them is a very bad idea. And I said it, and you will see it in the interviews I did on CBC. I said what is going to happen is that teachers will now get the excuse not to try and teach their children the best they can, because now they have an excuse. They will just say, oh, this kid is not doing well because of talent. And yet maybe the child was not doing well because the child had a bad day, they were not feeling well. There are also children who are late bloomers. They start to understand it much later than everybody else. But when you have an idea of talent, you're basically removing that whole lot and you're saying, too bad you didn't pass when you needed to pass. You go to TVET because that's where your talent, that's what God created you for. So this is a position that I don't agree with. I don't agree with the idea of talent, because talent in an equal economy is basically a pathway of discrimination. The second philosophy is the problem solving, that what we need is children who can solve tangible problems to solutions. I disagree with this philosophy. I understand where it comes from, but I disagree with it. First of all, in order to solve problems, you cannot be taught to solve problems. You need to be taught to understand society so that you can spot the problem and that you can diagnose it before you solve it. If we train children from very young to solve problems, we are going to remain a society in which outsiders continue to define our problems and our job is to solve them. That means we will never have any sovereignty. And to me, it's so amazing that Africans can still think like this. The second problem I have with this idea of problem solving, teaching problem solving, is that the job of children is not to solve problems. It's to expand their knowledge and their imagination. That's what education should be for at that stage in life. It is when they have understood society, it is when they have a vibrant imagination that they can produce solutions to problems. So to say we are going to have an education that is problem solving from the very early age of 4, 5, 6, that's ridiculous. Children need to be children. They are not adults. They need to have their time as children where their job is to grow their imagination and their creativity, not to solve problems which the adults have created. And the thing is, a lot of people misquote Paulo Freire on this. They say that this is the education that Paulo Freire was talking about. And I've explained in another video on this channel that Paulo Freire did not talk about problem solving. He talked about problem posing, that we have to sit down together and to understand our society, diagnose the problems together before we start talking of solving problems. This idea of reducing education to problem solving is a very dangerous idea because it is narrowing our minds. And in fact, Olufemi Taiwo also criticized that kind of thinking. He said, though we must seek knowledge to solve problems we know of, we must also seek knowledge when there is no problem in view. You cannot reduce knowledge to problem solving. And then he said, those who do not seek knowledge when it is not needed will not have it when they must have it. That's how it is. The reason why I am able to talk about CBC with the way I talk about it is because I had already started talking about the privatization and neoliberalization of education before CBC even showed its head. That's why I understand it. Now imagine if I had never done that work. I would not have been able to notice the issues with CBC. So problem solving is not something that you learn on the go. You have to have some background knowledge, some base knowledge, so that when the problem shows up, you already are prepared to deal with it. Even look at the army. Why do we have an army if there is no war? We have an army in case there is one. So this idea that we can only have armies when there's a war, how will you find the time to train if you have no army or waiting for a war? And this is what we are doing with education. We are not allowing children to learn anything. We are telling them, no, solve problems, create something. And we are not teaching them anything about background, about history, about creativity. We're not teaching anything for the mere expansion of their minds because we've already given them the adult responsibility of solving problems. So those of you who like CBC because it is teaching children to solve problems, that's a very flawed idea of education. And I'm just asking you to reconsider it. This is not something we should be giving to our children. Our children are supposed to be expanding their minds. not solving problems. It's us who should solve those problems. And if we can't, we need to ask why. And then the third group is people like me who say, we need to fix the economy first. That the problems that led to CBC were economic and political problems, and they cannot be fixed by tinkering around with what we are offering our children. And those of us in the Ubuntu philosophy, we are looking at it as, what does it mean to be human and to nurture? And number two, do our children understand our environment? How can we teach them the environment so that the day they need to solve problems, they have adequate information with which to solve the problems? And I've just remembered there's a fourth group that would be opposed to this idea. It's this group that is so scared of anything about going back. I don't know if you've noticed, but in Kenya, anytime an idea of going back is mentioned, people panic. Why do they panic? They panic because, in general, it is informed by our inferiority complex, where we feel that we were colonized because we were backward. And so our job now as Africans is to catch up with the West. So anytime people hear back to, it is going to things that are African, that have no place in the modern world. And by the way, even that attitude, we apply it to our cultures. People talk about going back to our cultures as if our cultures are not modern, and as if they're not present, and as if they're not still operational in today's world. So that is why whenever I suggested withdrawing from CBC and just returning to 844, people would panic, because anything that suggests back to means being backward, like the Europeans called us, and not being in touch with what is happening in Europe. And I don't know if you also noticed, most of the questions I would get in the early years of CBC are about what's happening in Norway. We have to catch up with the West. Now, people, we have to grow up. If we believe we are adults and we are human beings, we cannot live in a world where we are always catching up with others. We also are human beings on our own right, and we also have cultures that are quite relevant even to today. So going to a system that we used before is not an existential crisis. What I am suggesting is that we go to a system we know, because then we can deal with the problems that we don't know. But now we are dealing with both a system we don't know and the problems with it that we don't know. Afadhali, we remove some problems because we already figure out the system, and then we reduce the problems that we have to deal with. But those of you who are scared of not being like Wazungu, you will be scared of going back because you fear being backward. When it comes to Ubuntu, this is our position. If I am, because we are invested in the education of our children, because that education eventually affects us. And we do it because, not because of any job market or because of, I don't know what, profit and whatever, but because we care for our children as human beings, whether we have children in the system or not. Unfortunately, many middle-class parents who should have known better and who should have cared not just for their children, but for all children, they checked out of the education conversation. They decided that what matters is their own kids. So first of all, in fact, one of the reasons why they really bought into CBC was that individualist idea of talent. The idea that a child doesn't know broad knowledge, they should only do the knowledge which they enjoy, which is fun to them. We cannot go through life just doing what we enjoy. So they are the ones who bought into this idea and would refuse to listen to what it means for the child from a circumstances where the parent is not educated. In fact, me, when I was saying this thing disadvantages the poor, a lot of middle class was thinking subconsciously, at least my child has a chance because I'm educated and I can guide my child. In fact, even as early as 2018, there were middle-class parents who used to inbox me, like Nicodemus in the night, asking me, what can I do to save my child from the effects of CBC? Or even worse, can you be a tutor for my child as my child goes through CBC? In other words, me, I'm just dealing with my corner. Me, I don't care what other children are going through. So for us who think of everybody, that was not acceptable. We needed an education system that was not justifying inequality for anybody. In 844, we had inequality, but it was a result of the way the structure of the economy was. But now we are justifying it. We are saying it's okay to have inequality because what we are saying is that some people don't have talent. That was not an argument I could have accepted. I can't accept it for my own child. Why should I accept it for another child? Just this month, I have had a class where my students were struggling with the content that I was teaching. And so I asked them, how was your high school experience? And they explained to me what happened in that experience. Do you know what I did? I made adjustments because I am not the person who is going to say, oh, you don't have talent, you didn't go to a good school, so, oh, you poor 844, what's wrong with you? You'll never get this. You have no talent. What I did was that I looked for how can we remedy what the weaknesses in what happened when you were in high school. And we have started doing it, and especially one of my students has improved in ways I couldn't even imagine. All it required was a teacher who said, I believe you can do it. But what CBC is saying is that now no such teachers are allowed. We'll just say it's the talent. So you don't pass in my class, it's the talent. You don't pass in mathematics day one, I'll say, oh, mathematics confuses some people. That's what we have adopted in CBC. And that's why I've been saying philosophy is important. The reason why we do things also matters. So now with CBC, we've given teachers an excuse not to bother with our children. And me, even though my child is not affected, I cannot do that to somebody's child. I cannot. Maybe you can accept something like that for other people's children, but if you accept it for other people's children, you have to accept it for your own. And then lastly, I need to say this. Nobody is exempt from the effects of CBC. Nobody. This cynicism with which we have said that people fail because they lack talent and maths confuses them. We are going to pay for it in the next few years if we are not careful. Because all the children who have been abandoned because we've said no, maths is too confusing for them, they will be adults and they will realize, no, the problem wasn't maths, it was the attitude towards us. And by that time, your children will have fancy degrees because they went to a group of schools and they went to the right pathways. How are they going to respond to their age mates? Have you thought about that? Because the goal of a parent, and this is why I was saying the government had no business telling us about parenting. The role of a parent is to prepare children for the world. It's not to pay school fees. If it's about paying school fees, we can get scholarships. But the job of a parent is to prepare children for the world. So you pay for your posh school for the kid comes back with shiny certificates and finds a bitter 98% who are bitter with the education system. What is your child going to say? That this was my talent. Let her say that, you see how people say, oh, really? So it was your talent to go to a group of schools where there were labs. And me, I didn't get labs because I had no talent. So I have proposed a solution. Take it or leave it. But the window for getting out of this problem is growing smaller and smaller and smaller. Last year, I suggested the same thing. People didn't want to hear of it. The year before, I suggested the same thing. People don't want to hear of it. But I think this is the last year of that window. If we go into the senior secondary school with the inequalities we have, we better just be prepared for social problems in the next 4 years because they are coming. So let's just give it a thought. If you're a parent, just try to care for all children and stop thinking about your own. And this solution that I'm suggesting will not be easy, but to me, more people would be sold into it and they would be able to implement it, as opposed to now, where we are being told the solution to the problem is to tax parents more so that we can build schools. But even if we tax parents more, first of all, there's not enough money. But even if there was, those schools cannot be built to catch up with 2 years of bad education in the junior secondary schools. So it's up to us. You, wherever you are in your small space, put political pressure on the people who represent you and tell them what is happening in the education system is not sustainable. All the best.